One of the sadder things that occurred during the Soviet Union's era was Chernobyl. And Chernobyl was this brand new nuclear power plant that was being built in the Ukraine. They were running tests on it beforehand to make sure everything operated. And what happened was is this large air bubble formed. And they knew if they turned basically the energy off to that air bubble in the nuclear reactor, that the air bubble exposes radiation to the people, or to workers there. But if they let it keep going, the bubble could grow. So it was danged if you do, danged if you don't kind of situation. Eventually the bubble does burst. The nuclear rods were exposed to the air. You can see that where the explosion occurred right there on the right. And radiation spread across Europe. And you can see because of this radiation, a lot of children were born with birth defects. You can see the kid there, his head's weirdly shaped, I know. One of the other, I guess, on a brighter note of the Soviet Union, in 1958, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was the first reach of man into space. And Sputnik was this little bitty satellite. It was about 12 feet tall, legs and all. The ball part right there is about the same size as a beach ball. It was the first time that any country, any people have ever actually reached space. And the Soviets announced in 1958, we have reached outer space. And the Americans were like, no, you didn't, no, you didn't. But then some scientists started getting out their binoculars and telescopes and seeing this little ball track across the sky. And they realized, holy cow, the Soviets have reached space. If the Soviets can reach space, then the Soviets can put nuclear weapons into space. And so that was a great fear of the Americans. And so we decided we have to get into space too and prevent the Soviets from doing it first. And so there was the space race that started, and this created a large funding for math and science in American schools, and for America to push to get to the moon first. And if you've seen President Kennedy's speech back in 1960, he says, we're going to go to the moon. And so that's this big thing. He wants to, by 1970, be the first country on the moon, and we are successful. But if the Soviets had never launched Sputnik, we would have never even thought about going to the moon. A lot of Russia, if you want to get around in Russia, one of the best ways to do is to get there by rail. There is a large rail line that connects far, far, far Eastern Europe to far, far, far Western Europe. It takes about 2 weeks to ride from Vladivostok, which is down here, all the way over to St. Petersburg. It's a long ride, but it's one of the most reliable means to get around Russia. Looking at the religion of the former Soviet Union, a lot of it, well, some of it is Russian Orthodoxy, which is kind of like Greek Orthodoxy. It's similar to a version of Catholicism, if you want to think of it that way. They are Christian. There are other forms of Christianity that are growing, more evangelical forms. In the southeastern part, the steppe, Islam is predominant. Look real quick at the Baltics. The Baltics are Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They're more connected to Europe. They really don't like Russians because Russification was forced upon them after 1945, and so they didn't really appreciate that. So they kind of have a dislike and a distrust of the Russians. They focus more on Europe. In the southwest, we have Belarus, which wants to get back with Russia. They keep saying, we want to reunite with you. The Ukraine is a divided country. Half the country wants to get back with Europe, or get back with, half of the country wants to go with Europe, half of the country wants to get back with Russia. It is very rich agriculturally. It's probably the richest agricultural country in Europe because it has so much farmland. And there are a lot of immigrants that end up moving to the Ukraine, but also go through the Ukraine and end up crossing the border right here at the Slovak Republic and enter the European Union, because Slovakia is part of the European Union. And once you cross into a European Union country, you don't have to show any more ID to cross over the next border. You can just move from place to place. So this is kind of a mountainous area right here also. So they sneak in across the border and end up going through Slovakia. And Moldova has a lot of Romanian ties, and it has been selected the saddest country in the world. Just mentally, the people in Moldova are not very happy. One of the interesting things about Moldova is there's this little strip called Transdniester, and Transdniester is very loyal to Russia. When Moldova became part of the Soviet Union, the Soviets moved a lot of Russians to this area because this little strip is very rich in coal. So they needed the coal to help grow industry. So they have kind of separated from Moldova, and there are talks that eventually Transdniester will become part of Russia again. In the Caucasus, we have over 50 different people groups. That's a lot of different people groups. The warm climate draws a lot of tourists, plus you have the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea right there. The country of Georgia grows citrus fruits like oranges, a lot of tea. Azerbaijan is known for its oil. Armenia's had some trouble with its next-door neighbor, Turkey, over something that occurred back in World War I that some people call a genocide, others don't. In Armenia is Christian. Into the steppe or the stands region, and I don't like in the book how the guy starts using acronyms for all of this stuff. Usually it's just called the steppe. I don't know where he's getting some of this stuff from, but the steppe is predominantly Muslim. It's a very dry region, so they're very heavy into irrigation. Onions and garlic probably originated in this area. They grow a lot of cotton also, known as white gold there because of how well it grows. And because the governments there can be corrupt, bribes are very popular in this region. I had a friend of mine that actually went there, and so she took some pictures of what it looks like culturally in part of the steppe, the little cute cow on the right. But yeah, you can see how dry it is. There's not a whole lot of green out there. And that's a typical wedding in one of the areas. The bride wears red instead of white. Now we get to Russia. I'm going to try to go through this quickly here. You see the states or territories, or oblast of Russia. Some really, really big countries, or really big areas, and some small ones. It's twice as large as Canada, which is the second largest country in the world. A lot of people live in the south. It's the 9th largest in population. It was at one time like the 4th largest, but it's declining in population. And part of the reason for the decline is the high stress, the alcoholism, and the suicide. Some of the regions of Russia have declared their independence, but Russia has not recognized that independence. One of the big problems in Russia is seasonal affective or seasonal associative disorder. Because Russia is so far north, their winters are very long. During the daytime, in December, January, they may have 5 hours of sunlight, 4 hours of sunlight, and having a limited amount of sunlight can really impact your emotional mood. In Moscow, when people go to work at 8 in the morning, it's still dark, and when they get off work at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, it's already dark. The sun's already set because the sun may rise at 10 or 10:30 and set by 3:15. So this disorder of depression really impacts Russia. A lot of Russians make homemade alcohol called bathtub vodka. Vodka is like the national drink of Russia. Half of all alcohol consumed in Russia is bootlegged, made in home. There's a lot of high alcoholism, partially because of the SAD, seasonal associative disorder. So alcoholism runs rampant throughout Russia. There are kids who are heavy drinkers at 8, 9, 10 years old. So the Russian government has tried to tax vodka to prevent people from getting into alcoholism, but during the process, people have started making homemade alcohol instead to avoid being taxed.